This is Profound Conversations, a place for a discourse, a discussion about things that are meaningful to a population so that we can do better, be better, and live better. We're here with Brother Amin, and this is part two. So I want to just go into something that you were talking about, which is the economic development associated with Islam. I just came back from Ghana. And so as we were talking about the various elements of society, there are, of course, traditional African traditional religions that are there, and also people are largely Christian. But when it came down to a money exchange, the money exchange was being handled by those who practice Islam, primarily from the north. I thought that was very intriguing. It said that they have the wealth. Of course, I see something very similar in the Gambia, which is largely a Muslim country. I see something about economic development there. And you also talked about economic development within the context of America. Why do you think that is the case, that a population can practice a faith and then begin to function as economic independence as opposed to people who practice other faiths?
I think that for soulfully indigenous Muslims, or vis-a-vis Black Muslims, African American Muslims, economic development, and I'll put it in a larger context of community development. But there's no community without economics, so we can reduce it down to economic development is critical, and that's really the next frontier for us, because until we're able to develop our communities economically, the playing field is never going to be level, and we're always going to be not just behind other faiths, but we're going to be behind other ethnic groups of Muslims, because we find that for the most part, most soulfully indigenous Muslims, we've always stressed education, but entrepreneurship was always a major way out. A person can go and become an entrepreneur or learn a trade or start a business, or to be able to do something, other than just going to traditional college and becoming an engineer or a doctor, or those things that many immigrant Muslims traditionally become. So when those things are lacking from an economic development standpoint, meaning developing those businesses and those things that help us to really build our own economy within our faith tradition, how do we compete? How do we compete? And how do we grow our communities beyond being communities that strictly exist on charity, which is the issue that we have now? Most of the mosques and centers, it takes the old church, technique, which is just pass the bucket, and the Islamic version of tithing, charity, sadaqah, voluntary charity. You can't build a sustainable movement like that, or sustainable community like that in 21st century America. You're going to have some community development or economic development component. And we find that in those cities where indigenous Muslims have a critical mass, is usually the cities that also focus on economic and community development that are more successful and more progressive, as we would put it. And I'm not necessarily a fan of that term, but in this context, I think our listeners understand where I'm coming from. So again, and that's what set the nation apart, because Elijah Muhammad, he wasn't just standing on ideology. He wasn't just standing on the white man is the devil and he's the oppressor and the slave master. No, he was going to say, I'm going to show you what we can build and what we can do when we're free thinkers. I'm going to show you what we can do when we decide that we're going to do for ourselves. I'm going to be an example as a man with a third grade education. I'm going to show you what we can do in terms of economic development. So I think that that's an aspect that we definitely need to incorporate into our communities today. And if we do that, then we can really begin to really put forward a blueprint for what our communities look like, structurally, in every other way, in every aspect of what we define, and everywhere what we define community is all going to be rooted in how strong we develop economically to be able to, to achieve our goals and our visions.
I mean, that speaks volumes, right? The move forward. What is the move forward? So there was a discussion among the Nation of Islam about how developing a community and developing economic, to be able to have a voice, to be able to, you mentioned about steak intake. You mentioned about the businesses were pristine. You knew that it was quality food. You talk about canning your food. That was a do for self-movement and showing that it can be done, and even getting the provisions now, right? The lentil beans, other things that still goes on from the. And I say the same thing. I submit that those are the best lentil beans I've ever had, coming from that form. And they lentils like everything else, but somehow they just hit different. And so we have to be clear.
And navy bean that we developed the soup from, the bean soup. It's from navy beans.
The bean soup, right? Right, navy beans, right?
Yes,
and that's a move, and to develop a whole recipe for a bean pie. So I think you speak to that economic development part, and you speak about what's missing. In your book, you talk about data set, about how people join, how people fell off, where the numbers are, where the young people are, and how they get involved and not getting involved. Right. And you say that there's a shift, and the shift has been not in the youth joining or not joining, but the shift in Islam in this country has been with the immigrant population. And so you highlight the immigrant policy of 1965. Speak to that and how that has impacted Islam in this country, and also how maybe influencing economic development.
In the heyday of Malcolm X's time with the Nation of Islam, you had groups of Muslim students that were here on student visas, and they would establish themselves on college campuses and what have you. And they primarily were one of the main representations of Orthodox Islam in America, what we saw on the college campuses. That was facilitated by the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act, which reversed the Barred Origins Act of 1924, which forbid immigrants from certain places for coming here. So in 65, when they were able to come, that opened up the floodgate, so to speak, for all of them to come here to go to school and begin to establish themselves. In doing that, it started to, lay the foundation for what ultimately became the population shift. Because let's look at the number of years, 60 years from when that happened. So now those families that were here and others that began to immigrate in mass, they saw opportunity for themselves in America. They begin to multiply at a higher rate than what soulfully indigenous Muslim families would do. So basically now you look at the numbers, and the data shows us that where we used to have a majority in terms of Black Muslims or soulfully indigenous Muslims in America, now the immigrants are basically neck and neck with us when we start to look at all of the different, places that they come from, all of their lands of origin. And the reason that that's such an issue is because many of them, when they come here, and they have been here now, by the time they get to the third generation, the idea of community development and community building for them is central. It's a cornerstone to their idea of being American. Because again, as I talked about earlier off camera, they're not so much as focused all the time on theology as many of the soulfully indigenous Muslims. So because of that, we've seen them grow economically. We've seen their institutions be able to grow and thrive in a way that we haven't. And I think that part of that is because of just the lack of emphasis that we have in our communities and in our urban centers on functioning, at a higher level economically. It exists in some cities, but those cities, as in Los Angeles, Atlanta, Washington, D.C., there's a few others, they're outliers when it comes to how the immigrants have established themselves all throughout. And I just have to be honest in my assessment that in the 32 years that I've been doing this work, and 20 of them, 20 plus now, have been extensive in terms of travel, visited places of all sizes and all ethnicities all across America. Invariably, if you go into any city and there's an immigrant core of Muslims and there's a soulfully indigenous core of Muslims, the soulfully indigenous Muslims, and I hate to use this term, they're in last place. If you were to compare them to what immigrants may be doing on the economic development level. And this is not to say that we use the immigrant communities as the litmus test, but I'm just making a comparison for the sake of our discussion. If you look at what the immigrants have done since 1965 and growing their numbers and building communities, and you look at what we've done even post 75 in the 50 years after the foundation of Elijah Muhammad shifted into another direction, we're far behind in terms of where we need to be economically. So I think in order for us to have a conversation going forward about looking toward the future of Islam and Black America, the first topic of discussion has to be, how do we solidify ourselves economically and financially in order to be able to have community that's sustainable 10, 20, and 30 years from now? And I would end by saying that I truly believe that the decisions that collective Muslim indigenous leadership makes within the next 10 years may have a 50-year ramification of where we land. That's how critical things are at this point. The next 10 years worth of decisions
can affect 50 or even longer.
Will affect the next 50 years. Because in 50 years, I can remember vividly, like it was a few years ago, the events of 1975. And I was 11 years old. Now I'm 61. And 50 years has gone by, and I can clearly take you back decade by decade and look at our development or lack thereof and what the challenges was. And I can look at all the trends and patterns just on my own individual life research. So I'm clear that over the next 10 years, the decisions that we make or don't make will have ramifications for the next 50 years of Islam from the soulfully indigenous perspective.
You mentioned in your book about community development and activating the youth. I think that is so important for all movements, right? To make sure that the youth are involved. Right. In closing, I think that's one step. You talk about getting youth involved. Give us some things to leave with that we need to think about doing. The importance of Islam in this country to Black folks or social indigenous people. Some steps. What do we need to do to impact economic development within this particular community? What are some three to five steps?
I'll give you the first step that would then lend itself to 5 steps that would happen after that. The first step for me is redefining and reimagining the role of the mosque or masjid, the institution in America, the very institution that Muslims are committed to. Everything happens from that institution, engaging the youth, conversations and education around theological perspectives, economic development, social issues, mental health issues. All those things have to happen from within this institution. If the institution has been narrowly limited to just a place of prayer and religious discourse, then you're never going to be able to compete in the mainstream society because you're not broadening your topic of discussion. And that's one of the things that I made the comparison with. You heard I said one thing, I just gave you 5 subsets that will change after that. You can attract youth to a mosque where there are youth-centered activities. And see, the immigrants, when they come and they build it around a youth culture. So they build centers that are youth friendly. We primarily build spaces and have traditionally built spaces, and it's changing in some places, but the status quo has always been, you build the place, and the first thing we do as soulfully indigenous Muslims, we do 2 things. We pull out a compass to see where's the direction of prayer, and we pull out a tape measure so we can measure for the prayer rugs. Because it's not authentic until you start praying in there. It doesn't have any merit to us. It's not real till the rug goes down, as we say within my particular circle. So until we broaden the institution from that, and ironically, the prophetic tradition, the role of the mosque was much more broader than that. And even in the days of the Nation of Islam interpretation of mosque activities was closer to the prophetic tradition than the average masjid today. In the nation, we did everything from the mosque. Movie night, family night, cultural expression, plays. You talk to most people from the Nation of Islam during my parents' era, they met their spouse at a mosque activity, at a temple activity. We don't have that type of social interaction anymore. As people, we just pray and leave with some occasional activity here or there. So when we begin to spend time in real fellowship together beyond just the required worship, then we'll be able to come to the table and have those conversations in a broader way about economic development and social development and mental health and all those things that go into what we define as a healthy and productive society. So there's a lot, but let's start there. Redefine and reinvent the role of the mosque. And I think that once that happens, we'll see the shape of the community will start to change and things will start to just systemically get better, Youth
development, redefining what a mosque is, how does it function, What is its role within the development of a population growing its own? I think that is spot on, because that is where you begin to get community to grow from the children. Go places and when you don't have children, man, you don't have a community, because children make the community, and also children need guidance, and so that guidance comes from religious faith teachings and so forth. I think also that you don't have a community where there is no economic development, taking control of one's income, economic production, distribution of wealth, right? Being able to pass things. And I think that's also important. I see that being a very prominent aspect of Islam globally. There are some
critically important,
right? And then the issue of identity, right? Who am I within the context of this particular religion, of this faith, but also in this society, just stand and being able to move confidently throughout society because I know who I am. I have these practices. And I think those things are imperative to consider. So I want people to really understand the depths of the discourse and the need to understand the power of the state of Islam in Black America. It gave voice to the voiceless. It gave a perspective to those who had little or no perspective. It did not have to be a blackened version of a white interpretation of a religion, but it had something in and of itself that was distinct. It gave people a different name, so they didn't have to be named after whites, but they could be named something that was distinct. I think these things are critical. The question is it in the true Black man's religion? I think that can be questioned. Is it a religion that Africans came here with from the continent? That is not without a doubt. It happened. Yes. We know that among the populations of African people, all people have practiced have had a practice, and among the Bandinka, especially the people I spent some time with in the Gambia, where Kunta Kinte comes from, there is Islam, and inside of that, we clearly see traditional African practices. So our people were able to take alien religions, or those that came from someone else, or those that came from someone else with a different interpretation, and use it for their benefit. We can do that today. We can take what we have, make it into what we need to be who we have been created to be. This is Profound Conversations. Thank you so much, Brother Kasim Amin Nathari, for being here. And we're going to continue this conversation because it ain't over. This is only the beginning.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate you.